Welcome to our conversation. We start a series of videos today where we look at mental illness in the church. It's been said that there are 3 hidden struggles in the church: abuse, addiction, and mental illness. And today we bring light to that last conversation. So Joshua, tell me about this past year.
Well, about a year ago, I was serving full-time as a pastor at Sunnyside Mennonite Church, and also working through some medication issues of my own, because I have a major depressive disorder, and so this is something that was being maintained in my life, but I wasn't responding well anymore to a particular medication and needed to make some changes that began to a snowball of other changes into how ministry became less and less manageable for me. And so I needed to request some time off, and suddenly, as you know, what was managed and in the background or on the back burner in my life became a front burner issue, and then everything else goes to the back. And so I had to prioritize communication with our church board, and of course trying to walk through this process with integrity. And in light of so much confusion, there were so many factors that affected how that process unfolded, and eventually that led towards this past summer me being released from my position as the lead pastor there. And so now we're in a time of discerning, and I also had to go through some treatment this past summer to address changes that needed to happen in managing my mental health.
And in view of that overarching story, I want to hear what it was like for you personally, kind of in that in-between time.
Sure. This was devastating. I absolutely loved Sunnyside, and I loved being a pastor. I feel like this was something that God had clearly called me to. And so it didn't make a lot of sense. It was very confusing, and on top of the disappointment, there's a lot of shame that still comes with illness. And when we talk about a mental illness, which is much more invisible than, say, if I had cancer or a physical disability, and so there was a need to find words to express that. And of course, so often in the church, I think we have words that refer to both spiritual conditions and physical or mental conditions, and this isn't helpful. And so when we talk about depression, sometimes people might add, pressure to the idea that maybe I just need to pray more, or if I would just do this thing, that God would heal me. This isn't something that God has given me an immediate healing for, even though I still have that hope. But we've had to come to know His sufficient grace, provided in strengths and perfected in weakness. And so what this like for me, it's been a journey of being humbled and trying to hold a posture of humility before God and before our church, and also to keep doing what is right, to honor the responsibilities in my life. Most importantly, my marriage with Monica, our family, providing for our children, and keeping my heart right with God.
And you touched on how it affected the family, and I want to bring Monica into the conversation of what was this like for the family?
Well, initially speaking for myself, it was, utterly terrifying. I mean, it wasn't the first time that Josh had gone through a struggle, or I would call it crisis in his mental health, but it was probably the most dramatic because it came on very quickly because of his change of medication. And so, you know, I had to watch my very loving, friendly, outgoing husband begin to isolate, not only from our community and our friends, but from me. And just to, you know, he started walking around with his hood up and always feeling cold and his body hurt. And it wasn't just his mood, it was just like all of him changed. And so it was scary, and it was, you know, I constantly worried if he was going to hurt himself or if he had a plan. And it's terrifying to have to ask the person you love the most in the world, you know, if they have plans to hurt themselves, or and also feeling powerless. You know, we had 4 young children, and I felt like I had to keep everything together for them, and yet also support Joshua, and just in the midst of a pandemic and living away from family, it felt very scary. It felt isolating, and yeah, it was honestly very hard to hold on to hope a lot of the time. And also there was the constant fear of, as a pastor, is he going to lose his job? And so that was also a very scary part of it for me, which made church life uncomfortable. Also, I didn't know how to answer people's questions when they wanted to know, like, how he was doing. So yeah, church felt really uncomfortable to me. And there was a lot of times that I was perfectly okay with hiding over Zoom instead of attending on a Sunday morning. And so, yeah, it was, it kind of felt like I had my feet knocked out from under me, and all of a sudden I had to crab walk through life carrying all of my family and Josh's struggle and the concerns for our church community on top of me. And so, yeah, it was a very, very scary year for me. And Janae, you really have journeyed with us through this past whole year as a friend and as a church member, and just also want to hear about your experience with this past year, and maybe some insight from how the church was also experiencing it.
It was clear in even your description of where we were as a church, even positioned in this in-between pandemic. We're in Zoom, who's still in church, who's, you know, just not able to make it in Zoom. And so I think there was that initial beginning time, the church was unaware of how affected your family was with this crisis. I had the unique position of having my husband part of the elder team, and so we became privy pretty quickly to what was going on with your family. So separating church versus friend is maybe a little difficult to figure out what fell where, but I think it is a testament to Sunnyside of how relational our church is. That those two overlap in our story. I don't think that's unique to only us,
Right.
With Sunnyside. And so it became very apparent quickly of how do we support the Jefferson family while caring for the church community. That I feel like that was the dance that happened, both practically in leadership and then relationally between the families of where can we give, where can we support, where do we need to find other support. I think those were the big questions and the barriers and buffers that helped and carried everybody through those pieces to figure out.
Yeah.
And so that's the overarching kind of story. And I thank you for sharing vulnerably of what happened individually as a family and bringing light to our community as church through this struggle. And I invite you back as we continue this conversation of what this meant through the struggle of mental illness. Joshua, we want to hear how you have experienced major depressive disorder.
Okay. Well, this is a diagnosis that I had come to terms with after I had left a position working for the school district and started in ministry. And my first full-time ministry job was as a youth pastor, and that's when I started to notice that things weren't right. People were flexible, and the position was intense. It was at a larger church, but I noticed that something was wrong internally, and for most of my life I had thought about that as like a problem, a spiritual problem, like a lack of spiritual maturity, like I wasn't praying enough or I wasn't close enough to God, and why I wasn't experiencing joy when I was so grateful for the things in my life, like my wife and my family, and even my physical health. But things were getting worse and worse to the point where, especially when I started in this full-time ministry job, when there was a little bit less structure, less of a routine, and more of a challenge for time management and long-term planning, I started to notice myself getting more and more anxious and more desperate to escape. My escape-oriented thinking began with just like thinking I need to quit my job, or I need to, I just would imagine myself just driving until I ran out of gas, and then just running until I ran out of energy and disappearing. I just wanted to disappear. I felt like taking on any responsibility felt like a potential of letdown and disappointment to others, and so that made me feel kind of embarrassed about it. And then on top of that, the fact that it got to the point that I started to wish that my life would end, it's hard to talk about because it doesn't make sense when it seems like I should be so grateful when people would tell me, well, you have such a, you have the life that I wish I had, or something like that. That didn't help. It would just make me feel more guilty for feeling the way I did. But it got to the point where every day I would think, I wish I would get hit by a car or something that would just take me out of the equation, but not dishonorably. I don't want to be a quitter. And I know it's not God's will for me to end my life, and yet I felt like my very existence was a problem. And so depression is for people who struggle with depression, I understand that this is like, you just want relief. It's not like you actually want to die. It's just like you want your consciousness to be relieved of its state of not rightness, a state of conflictedness, or even of pain. So at a physical level, I started to feel more and more things like back pain. I had a panic attack at one point, which is a lot like a kidney stone, curled up in a fetal position, just feeling like I just wanted to die. At a spiritual level, I felt so conflicted, like this is my fault. And mental illness is something that can be rooted in genetic factors or physiological factors that are outside of one's control. And so it's not an individual's fault that they have a mental illness. And yet it feels like you're causing a problem by even talking about it. And why can't you just hold it together? And really, we're human. We are we are a blend of strengths and weaknesses, abilities and disabilities. So I think one of the hardest parts was how isolating it made me feel. It felt like a problem that nobody understood, a problem that caused stress to everyone that I love. And so shame was a big part of that journey for me as well.
Mm-hmm. And thanks for sharing that. You're really dispelling this idea that major depressive disorder is just someone who feels really sad all the time. Mm-hmm. Really looking into that, wanting to escape. Nobody understands that isolating feeling. And you started touching on this already, and I'm wondering if you can go a little more in depth of what was helpful and what was not helpful as you engaged with others in family, church, community, as we look,
Yeah.
from the outside in,
Mhm.
what actually helped
Yeah.
you and what was not?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. Honestly, what was helpful to begin with was even getting a diagnosis, talking to my doctor, telling him the symptoms that I was struggling with, and receiving a diagnosis in a sense gives you a sense of like, okay, like this is something that it's identifying the challenge. It puts it in a kind of a category because it feels like it's everything. It feels like it's all of your life. So even knowing that I had depression was a big part of what was helpful for starting the journey of how do I live in response to that. What also was helpful for a significant period of time was a medication that I was taking, and it was helping me to manage my depression for 3 good years of ministry at Sunnyside. Making this a back burner issue that I could maintain, and I continued to see a counselor to talk about this and managing this. But when that medication wasn't working for me anymore, it brought it back to the front burner again, where then work became almost impossible, and relationships became very complicated. And so there needed to be a priority with what I paid attention to at that point. And so what was helpful for me, it's, again, I had to, ministry isn't for people with an ego. It shouldn't be anyway, because in my ego, of course, I want to either be the champion of this thing or I'm the victim, and where I would just rely on the sympathy of others. But the truth is, there's a blend of things involved, and I see myself more as a pilgrim, more as a journeyer through this, where this is something that doesn't have complete control over my life, but it's not something I can master through, determination and wisdom. So it's not helpful. I think Googling symptoms can lead you down long rabbit trails and make things feel completely... For a while, I wondered if I had Alzheimer's disease, early onset or something. I was at that point of just disillusionment and inability to think clearly. But one of the best pieces of advice I ever received from a mentor, he said, don't let what you can't do stop you from doing what you can do. And for me, I carried that and had to learn that because I wanted to either push harder or give up. And the easy yoke, the light burden of Jesus, I believe, is taking what God does provide and using it well, managing it in light of what you can't and what you don't have. And so for me, there are things that helped, like just journaling, talking to a counselor, exercising regularly. These are things that were within my sphere of influence, things that I could manage, and what lended towards progress in my life. Talking about it was necessary, and of course, in relationship to the church, what was most helpful, I believe, was transparency. I didn't have the answers. I didn't know how we were going to get through this together. All I could say is, this is what I'm experiencing. I'm talking to a doctor. I'm talking to a psychiatrist. He's recommending a medication. I'm trying a medication. This medication isn't working well. We're trying another one. This one's not working well. And then I was prescribed a treatment called TMS, which stands for transcranial magnetic stimulation, a 10-week process. It was 36 sessions of something like an MRI that stimulates a region of the brain they believe is responsible for major depressive disorder. And that took place after Sunnyside had released me, with some severance that allowed that to happen, provided for us during that time. And so that treatment was helpful, but it wasn't a magic bullet. I'm still working on this. I'm still on this journey, and we've seen progress on it, but there's no light switch. You can't just turn it off. You can't just make it go away. It's something that affects me at a physical level and shapes a lot of the challenges that I face in the long term.
And so I want to pull Monica into the conversation a little bit of also what you experienced as helpful or not helpful while you walked and journeyed with Joshua.
Yeah, I mean, There was a lot of things that were very helpful. People who asked us very practically, like, can we help you with this? You know, like you, Janae, you and your husband offered us childcare, very like specific days, specific times. We knew we had that relief coming, to just get a break from the kids, and so that was very helpful. We got so many people asking how can we help, which didn't feel helpful, because we didn't know. Like, we didn't know what we needed. We didn't know what would help. I feel like when you're in a place of crisis, every interaction you have with someone else feels overly vulnerable. And so, like, just answering, like, how you need help, it's just, I would get stuck on hours just knowing how to answer one text message and finally not even answer it because I didn't know what to say. And so, just, very practical offers felt like the most helpful.
Where all you had to think of was yes or no.
Exactly. Exactly. Sunnyside walking with us financially was very helpful. Like, not having to worry about, like, the bills or anything like that. Like, that relieved a huge amount of the stress. And just knowing that we were cared for like that are some of the first things that come to my mind.
And thank you for sharing. It's very helpful for people who maybe have not walked with someone before, not knowing, right? Oh, how can I help is not helpful. Sharing wisdom of just pray more, right, is not helpful.
Right.
So those are really insightful pieces to impart to others as they try and journey with others. So we welcome you back to the conversation as we continue on. Welcome back. It's been said a disability is held by an individual but belongs to the family. And so today we're going to continue our conversation with Monica and how she experienced. And so, Monica, what did you experience in this past year as you journeyed with Joshua?
Well, I think journey is a really good word to use because it has been a journey. I don't know how, maybe it is just some training and counseling or what, but somehow I just knew I had to take care of myself along this journey. Like when you're on an airplane and they say, put your own oxygen mask on before you help the person next to you. Like, I just knew that I needed to do that. And so, like, I was really intentional about trying to make sure I stayed well in the midst of this year. Because I knew if I was like, I'm just going to grit and bear it until the end, that I wasn't going to be okay at the end. And so, like, I was very intentional about taking a lot of walks in nature. There's something about being in God's creation that has always been very grounding to me, and especially as I walked, and it's been like a whole year, this journey, I've seen the seasons change, and the changing of the seasons would always remind me that things don't stay the same, like they change. And yeah, we started the season last fall, and it was our woods got bleak looking, but as time went on, then spring came, and and brought, just being in God's creation just really brings hope for me. And so that was one of the things that really helped me get through this past year. I also was really intentional about being in counseling. I was in counseling for months and months and months, and that was also just a place where I could be just completely honest, and a place where I could just receive ideas, feedback, just really helped me grow. and really helped. I remember one time we just talked about how this past year has been kind of like bad sunburn for me, and I needed to keep applying the Elavir. And that was just like a really good imagery for me, that I needed to make sure that I could stay well, so that I could support and love Joshua the way that I want to. So that was really, taking care of myself was key in this past year. It also helped me take care of my family as best as I could. We have 4 young kids, and so like as much as we were able, we talked to them very openly and honestly about Joshua's struggle. If he was trying a new medication, we would explain that to them. Or if we, talked about why Daddy might be sleeping a lot, or why he's, going off alone a lot. We tried to normalize the conversation as much as we could. Just talking about depression and naming it, and asking them if they wanted to talk about it, or and we just, as much as possible, just tried to keep their world safe. And even through it all, Joshua has been very amazing father, and just being able to be present with them and still helping them through this time. We often say we don't want to protect our kids from drama, but from trauma. And so like we keep that in our mind as when we're struggling as well, that we're impacting their little lives. And so, so just normalizing the conversation was really important to me, for them to have words to express this experience if they need to, or if they ever struggle with mental health. So that's been another big part of this year, is just feeling like I'm navigating and watching, and just seeing how the kids are doing. And then of course, like supporting Joshua has been, honestly, a lot of times I didn't know how to or what he needed. Or, sometimes I was like, do you want to be alone? Do you want to talk? Do you, I didn't always know. A lot of the time I didn't know. But I prayed a lot this year. I learned truly what it means to live in God's daily sufficient grace. Like, we're only guaranteed today anyway, and not to worry about the future. It's like, in this moment, we're okay. Everyone's safe. We have food. We're well fed. We know people love us. And so I feel like I learned in a way that I never knew how to before, just to be present and to not be scared of what seemed like darkness. And knowing that God's light is always there and always with us. And just, I tell my kids that one of the greatest gifts God has given them is their imagination. And so I would often use my own imagination to, whether it's just envisioning God with us as we're talking, or whatever it might be. But yeah, that was, just a little bit about what it's like for me this past year. To journey as a family and individually.
So you really shared from your personal experience and in the family, and how it was a challenge being in the community. And so I'm curious what you took from your learning individually, as a couple, and as a family, that overlapped in any way with your experience with the church, and how to enter back in that space.
Well, this past year there have been numerous individuals who have really journeyed with us, and with me specifically, that have been extremely helpful for me. I feel like I now understand what it's like to be part of a community, and I think if I backdrop to what really solidified that for me is actually when Joshua was released, because that for me was a very, very challenging. I felt like we were just moving out of crisis when that happened. Like, as a family, his treatments were lined up for the TMS. I was like getting hopeful, like we're going to come out of this okay. And then the church board and leadership discerned that it was best for Josh's well-being to release him from that position, which I understood. but my experience of that was very painful. The church had been a steady support for me. I didn't even realize how much of a steady support they had been for me. And so when they released him from his position, it felt like they were knocking their support away from me. And now I was a mess and didn't quite know how I could best support him when he was actually the one who lost his job, but I was grieving the community effect of that and what that would look like. Because now I didn't feel comfortable at church anymore, and yet these are my people who I love and who have journeyed with us. And like I was there at the meeting when they released Josh from his position, and that in itself was very, very painful for me to be present for that. Janae, you're one of the first people I talked to after that, and I know we got together and we talked and we cried and we grieved together, and also they were going to have a special service for Joshua, and I really wanted to be there, but I didn't know if I could just because of my own pain. And I remember I texted you and said, would you meet with me and pray with me in the room where they released Joshua? I needed to do that for the next step of my healing. And I just remember like that moment didn't make everything better, but I really sensed God's presence with us as we talked through what happened, and we prayed, and we just committed the pain and the journey to God. And I just remember that feeling like a sacred time. And I just kept sensing God saying there is something that we need to learn in this place of brokenness that we can't learn in when everything's just great. And so I really appreciated you going through that with me and journeying with me through that. And I'm curious just kind of what your experience was like, as well as you kind of had to dance between being my friend, being our friend, and also being a church member, your husband being an elder. Just kind of what was your experience like in that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that dance word does capture what happened. When people ask, how did you know what to do? I really don't have a great solidified answer, but it pushed back on the relationship, the history we had. It's not a definitive answer I can give to anybody walking through this journey with someone, but relying back on who we are as friends, really guided how to support you as a family, and then dancing into the next role of what's needed for the church. What's the relationship there? What's the history? How can I be who I have always been in a congruent way with what is currently happening? Right? Because it's shifted. Things have happened. I can't do exactly the same, but what in the same spirit of our relationship can I extend? And so on practical levels, we've talked a little bit of us watching your kids. They were over at our house all the time before this happened. So it was very natural for us to extend that as soon as we heard things were becoming more of a crisis mode. And I resonate with your journey of staying in the present. That was kind of mirrored my own experience of you can't walk away. Press into this moment, even though it's uncomfortable. You having experienced and learned that with time with Joshua, how do I care for myself well to be well in this space? I also had to do that. How do I stay in this moment, even though it's very sad and hurtful, right, of what's going on around us, but how do I meet Monica at the church? And we do this well, because this is the moment. It's the critical moment, and we need to show up. So knowing when those being able to identify those critical moments, recognizing how can I be true to myself and this relationship, and pressing into that instead of running the other way, were the big markers and buffers as I did the dance through this journey. So that feels like it captures the outward picture of finding our way through the journey, not knowing ahead of time the steps that are coming, but discerning and figuring out together.
Yeah, one of Josh and my takeaway for this from this whole past year, one of the phrases that we would always ask ourselves was just, what's the next right thing? And we can't do everything, but we can do the next right thing. And sometimes that's taking a walk or doing the dishes or whatever. Like, just do the next right thing and try not to worry about all the rest. So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing. And join us for more conversations. Welcome back. In one of our previous conversations, Monica shared that your mantra through this journey has been, take the next right step. And so what has been kind of your process of discerning what that next step is through the journey?
Yeah, that's this has been a journey that we didn't have a clear map for, right? There are so many unexpected parts and unfamiliar territory to all this. I wasn't expecting to lose my job. I was expecting to be a pastor much longer, and hope someday again. But not knowing what those steps are, we sometimes refer to it as a great embark into the dark. The discerning process for us, even for like starting and stopping a medication, it's so hard when, an antidepressant is a medication that takes time to work. And I struggle with impulsivity, especially when I feel a crisis. So like just trying to fix it, finding a solution to something, and just overreacting to the first sign of a negative side effect. There are some that are like whether it's an allergic reaction, okay, you need to stop. But if you're uncomfortable, well, maybe you need to press through. And so for me, I can't say I've always made those decisions well, but I've had to rely on my relationship with Monica and her discerning. And psychiatrists will tell you that sometimes your spouse notices your improvement before you do, and so her input is just as valuable, if not more so, than my own personal experience in knowing whether this is a step forward or not, what that next right thing is for us. And so starting and stopping a medication, really needing to say, we are deciding this together. Also, I'm not the doctor, and it's all I can do is give feedback and say, this is how I'm experiencing it, but sometimes that's normal, sometimes it's not. The problem with Google is that we can help make ourselves feel like we're experts on something when we're reading information that may not be well supported or well documented, or at least accurate from a very narrow margin of perspective. So for us, of course, thinking about Proverbs 3:6, where it says, "In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your path." Last week, when we had invited some members from our church to come and pray with us, to have a time of discerning together, what we did is we said, listen, we trust you at a personal level because you've journeyed with us this past year and you know these things. So please don't feel like you're asking too personal a question. We need to talk about what's the next step for us as we think about jobs, as we think about finances, and even as I'm thinking about medication. Because after this treatment, I did see some progress, some recovery happening, but not at a place where I'm content to just stay where things are at. Because I have to live with the results of wherever we're at. And I know I have to be an advocate for myself to say, this isn't wellness, because when I'm well, I know that I'm creative, I'm more supportive of others, I'm more productive with my time. I know what wellness looks like, and so I also realize that there are some places that isn't where I'm at yet. So anyway, having to talk to my doctor after finishing this TMS treatment, I had something called a gene test done. And they take your DNA, and in different categories, they'll tell you, here's what medications you might not benefit from, and here are some that would. And so after getting that done, we narrowed down a lot of the ones that I already tried and didn't work, and maybe I could have saved myself some time. But then bringing that to my psychiatrist and saying, well, now let's look at, with a more narrow range, maybe here are some possibilities. So I'm trying another medication even right now. And I delayed taking it today just so that I could have more clarity for this interview, just because of some of the side effects. But making those decisions for me, it's not assuming that I know all the answers, but still having to be a self-advocate, you know. So talking to people who are qualified in offering medical advice. And then, of course, inviting a discerning team along with us to support us in making difficult decisions. And so some of those, I left that meeting afterwards feeling like we're on the path. This is the path. What we thought was a detour is really the main street here. God is calling us through this journey, and we hope it's a journey that can bring hope and healing to others. The hope and healing that we're having to find for ourselves in Christ. A verse that comes to my mind is from Psalm 84, verse 6, where it says, as you pass through the valley of Baca, they will make it a place of springs. The autumn rains will come and fill it with pools. The idea of travelers going through this valley of Baca, which means weeping, is a place of dryness. And so we're like digging pits, because when those autumn rains come and fill it with pools, travelers behind us, we hope, will benefit from those pools that we didn't have, ones that weren't there for us. As we've been kind of groping in the dark, we are hoping that we're leaving little nightlights, you know, behind us, in a sense, for people who are walking a similar path. It's a very isolating thing to feel like, as I'm encountering a mental illness, because we don't talk about these things a lot in the church, and yet I realize it is not uncommon. Anxiety and depression especially are very common mental illnesses that people encounter during their life. But as common as it is, that doesn't make it feel like any less of a severity for me. I still need to find a place of wellness in my own life before I can be in a place to support the wellness of others. I think about that story of the wounded healer. You know, there's a Jewish legend where he says, where somebody asks their rabbi, where will I find the Messiah? And he says, he's at the city gates sitting with the lepers. He said, well, how will I know which one is him? And he says, he's the one that unbinds his wounds one at a time, and not all of them at the same time. And he unbinds each one at a time, saying, just in case I might be needed for someone else. That idea of pacing yourself in your self-care. As I've been processing this, we want to be available for others. We want our lives to be lived as a light in the darkness and to bring hope. But that's hope that we're having to find for ourselves as well. So binding up our wounds one at a time, pacing this journey of recovery and wellness for us has been that discerning process. The other thing that comes to mind is that they say that if you tell me where a person's wound is, that's also where their genius lies. We've learned a lot from this process, and it's also given us a burden for those who are also affected by mental illness, and that's why we wanted to take this opportunity, and really any opportunity, to use our story to bring hope and healing to others, because God has allowed this to happen, and God's plan is ultimately redemptive, that He will use even weakness and suffering in our lives to accomplish the saving of life. And so for us, this is something we hope, even though we don't see the other side of this, an opportunity like this to share our story with you and with LMC. And also we went through a training. We were invited to a training to be facilitators for something called WRAP. It stands for Wellness Recovery Action Planning. And when we were invited to do that training, we were like, yes, it's so clear to be able to use what we just experienced as a tool to be able to serve what we began this series talking about, something hidden in every congregation, is something that we say yes to. That's a discerning that was easy for us to say, that's the next right thing for us. To take that training opportunity and hopefully to use our story and some of the insights that we gained, in becoming experts on our own areas of weakness, and suffering, to use those as points of connection with others, and points where we hope that the gospel of God's grace and its sufficiency to each day, can be something that not only do we cling to for our own needs, but we can use to bring hope. In that, how do you think about that discerning process?
I think it's, like you said, just taking one step at a time and seeking a counsel from others, and seeking to be unified in our decisions, and not making decisions if we aren't unified. And just trusting that this is the path. We don't understand it, we might not have chosen it, but this is the path, and that God has been calling us to. And so just holding on to hope and holding on to trust, and allowing our community to come around us and discern with us as we move forward.
I thank you for sharing so vulnerably your journey, your experience, and your hope that it can speak to others' experience, that beautiful metaphor of helping to illuminate the path for those who continue the journey after you. So thank you for sharing your story. And thank you for joining in on our conversation on mental illness in the church.